You're listening to the Fierce Fatty Podcast, episode 133. I'm your host, Vinny Wellsby. What is the title of this episode? Is the O-word crisis a myth? Question mark. Let's do it.
Perfect.
Hello. Sorry, I didn't have my my page. I didn't have my screen on the front of my. I've scrolled down in my document. Okay, I wasn't at the title. Is the obesity epidemic real? That was the title. Is the obesity epidemic real? I'm sure you'll get it. Hey, welcome to this episode. Nice to see you. Nice. If you're British, you'll recognise that. If you're British and about 37 years old. Welcome to this episode. I'm feeling like a 7 out of 10 today on the life satisfaction scale that I just made up. I did a training yesterday for healthcare professionals or anyone who has clients who are fat, dietitians, fitness influencers, that type of thing, called How to Make Your Social Media Presence Fat Positive, Critical Mistakes to Avoid, and What to Do Instead. It was so fucking good. I'm tooting my horn, toot the shit out of it. So I shared case studies and examples on what to do, what you want to avoid doing on social media if you have fat clients, like aka how to not fuck up fat people with your content, with a huge kind of disclaimer of we're all gonna fuck up, and I've made all of the mistakes. Pretty much I've made so many of the mistakes. Anyway, so that was really good. If you want to catch the replay, the recording, you can. I'll put a link in the show notes. But if you ever want to do consulting with me in any way, shape or form, like having me come to talk to your company or train your dietitians or do an audit of your stuff, you can always go to fiercefattyconsulting.com. Okay, so I can't believe I've not already done an episode specifically on the quote obesity epidemic. Huge trigger warning. I'm going to be using the O words. I'm going to try and get rid of them. Get rid of that shit as much as possible. But I mean, it's in the title, right? So if that's if you're I just don't want to hear the O words, I don't want to hear Vinny say quote unquote 75 times, then skip this episode. But I feel you know what, there's sometimes when you're talking to folks and you, when I say you, I mean you, not me. Well, me too, I guess. But when we're talking to people about this stuff, how fat people are human and stuff, and people are oh, gross. No, they're not. And they will come up with speaking points that they don't really know much about. It's just kind of regurgitated information that they've heard online, or the we all know stuff, which is we all know that fat people are unhealthy and they're going to die and all that type of stuff. And so I thought, an episode talking about the obesity epidemic, what it is, where it's come about. Is it real? Is it valid? At the end, I'll give kind of an overview. So you've got that kind of overview. Also, I'm going to make it into a little social media post, a bullet point thing. So if you're listening to the episode, then it's probably going to be up on my Instagram already, kind of a bullet point of everything that I'm sharing, so that you can share that on your social media if you want, or if you just want to reference it, about this epidemic of fat people going round and eating babies off the street. Oh my God. Yeah, so fun times. I'm going to be reading from a few different sources here. I've decided there's one article that is just so fucking good. I'm just going to read the whole thing. I was like, oh, I'll pick up this quote. And then I'm like, no, I'll pick up this quote. Oh, there's this one too, this one too. And I was like, it's a whole fucking article. It was just so good. It's not that long anyway. So, but it's so good. It was just like, the person they're interviewing is no longer alive, because this is an interview from, I think, like 12 years ago. Anyway, so I'm like, oh, it's so sad that they're not alive anymore, so we can talk about this stuff. Anyway, so basically, I say basically, we're starting a probably hour-long podcast. Basically, and then I'm going to talk for an hour. Let's start with this. Let's start with an excerpt from a book written by Harriet Brown that came out in 2015. I read it in 2015, and like, kind of heads up, she uses the O words, right? And the book excerpt was made into a kind of post for the New York Post. So it's an excerpt of the book, but you can read it online. I'll link to all the show notes, all of the studies, everything I mentioned is going to be in the show notes. fiercefighting.com/133. So the title of this article is "The Obesity, quote, Crisis is a Myth." The book by Harriet Brown is called Body of Truth. Harriet Brown, author of Brave Girl Eating. I read that one too. I think that was about her daughter who had an ED. Correct me if I'm wrong. My person who is not here, you can't respond. Nobody. That's not right. Anyway, so yeah, kind of like take this with a kind of grain of Harriet's maybe not as clued in on social justice language versus looking at science and that type of stuff. Okay, so here's a quote from that. Back in 1958, A.J. Stunkard, a well-known obesity researcher and professor at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote of obese people who lose weight, most will regain it. Just a heads up, that is, so, FYI, that is the first study, what Harriet is talking about here, 1958, Stunkard study, is the first study that says 95% of diets fail. So, people who are pro-diet will say, well, there was just one study from the 50s that says that 95% of diets fail, and that's what people are quoting, and that's what people are using, so data is so out of date. If that was the only study, then yeah, 1958, that data would be so out of date, but this is the first time it was established, and it's been re-established many times over. Really good science on that, but that's just like the inception of it. Okay, just a heads up. Continuing, in the 1970s and 1980s, scientists like Paul Ernstberger, now a nutrition professor and researcher at Case Western University, began to document the ways dieting did and usually didn't work. Nearly 30 years ago, Ernstberger and a colleague published an exhaustive review of the links between health and obesity. They pointed out that 16 long-term international studies had found that overweight and obesity were not major risk factors for death or heart disease. A US panel on obesity had relied heavily on data from the insurance industry, and since fewer heavy people bought life insurance because they had to pay more for it, the mortality rates linked to obesity skewed higher. Ernstberger also drew attention to the fact that mortality rates were lowest in the overweight category on the BMI chart. He and his colleague hypothesized that some of the conditions associated with obesity, like hypertension and elevated cardiovascular risk, actually came from failed treatments. That is, weight cycling, or losing and regaining weight over and over. And they suggested that many doctors' disapproval of fatness was based on moral and aesthetic biases rather than medical facts, a suggestion that has since been born out of research into doctors' clear prejudices around obesity. In 2002, William Klisch, a pediatric gastroenterologist, featured in the movie Supersize Me. Did you watch that movie? I fucking loved that movie. Oh my God, that was Supersize Me. Was that, what was that guy's name? Morgan. Ginger Balls. He went, and the premise of the movie was he was only allowed to eat McDonald's for X amount of days, like let's say a month, 2 months, whatever. And then he was a vegan before. And if they offered to supersize at the McDonald's, he had to accept it. Turns out he got fed up of eating McDonald's. Surprise! Fucking surprise! And the thing is, right, like this whole... I don't think most fat people are eating McDonald's 3 meals a day. It's, the whole thing is just, the whole movie was fucked up, right? The whole movie was fucked up. Anyway, continuing on. If you've not seen it, don't bother. It's a fucking... I loved it at the time because it was fat phobic, but, you know. Anyway, okay, so the pediatric gastroenterologist featured in the movie Supersize Me told a reporter from the Houston Chronicle, if we don't get this obesity epidemic in check, for the first time in this century, children will be looking forward to a shorter life expectancy than their parents. Now, have you heard that before? That children are going to be... We're going to be burying children because they're going to be so fat and unhealthy. You've heard that before. I've heard that before. Maybe you haven't, but, you know, it's very common rhetoric. Think about how much data and science is behind that. What we had to look into to get that data that this gastroenterologist on the Supersize Me movie saying that kids are going to die before their parents. Continuing, as Klisch later admitted, he had absolutely no evidence for this frightening scenario. It was based on his, quote, intuition, which didn't stop it from being replayed in the media and cited by researchers. Of course it didn't, because that's a sexy thing to say. Kids are dying before their parents because they're so fat. Evidence? Nah, nowhere for evidence. I've got a crystal ball. My Mystic Meg brain is saying kids are so fat they're going to die. Ooh, research? You don't be silly. Yeah, so continuing. So Klisch's doomsday scenario lives on in part because it's frightening. And fear, whether justified or not, is a big part of the way that we talk about weight, especially when it comes to children. According to the most recent numbers from the CDC, almost half of American kids and teens fall into the either overweight or obese categories, blah, blah, blah. The problem with the BMI is it's not accurate measurement or predictor of health. Blah, blah, bloop, bloop. It says nothing about a person's future risk of disease or death, and it was never intended to. Its creator, as we know, Belgian mathematician Adolphe Quetelet, came up with the BMI in the 1830s as a way of looking at trends in populations, not in people. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Meanwhile, the cut-off points for BMI have been moved somewhat arbitrarily within the last 15 years. Starting in 1994, the National Institutes of Health considered children in the BMI, whose BMI put them in the 95th percentile or above for their age, overweight. Those in the 85th to 95th percentiles were labelled at risk of being overweight. In 2005, the category shifted. Now kids above the 95th percentile are labelled as obese, while those in the 85th to 95th percentile are overweight. And according to Colorado law professor Paul Campos, author of The Obesity Myth, another little-known change happened at the same time. Those percentiles were defined using data from the 1960s and 1970s rather than data on kids today, who are both taller and heavier than kids back then. In other words, writes Campos, when Michelle Obama claims a third of our children are too fat, what she's really saying is that what was the 85th percentile on the height weight charts 40 years ago is about the 67th percentile today. The changing definitions make it hard to track how kids' weights rather than their weight categories have actually changed. Like adults, kids' average weight rose between 1980 and 2000 when they more or less stabilized. Let me read that again. Like adults, kids' average weights rose between 1980 and 2000 when they more or less stabilized. Childhood fatness is commonly referred to as both an epidemic and a call to action. In 2010, when First Lady Michelle Obama launched her Let's Move campaign, her goal was to, quote, solve the challenge of childhood obesity within a generation. Are we really raising a generation that, for the first time, will not live as long as their parents? Catherine Flegel, we talked about Catherine Flegel a couple of episodes ago, an epidemiologist at the CDC's National Center of Health Statistics, set out to map the relationship between BMI categories and mortality. They expected to find a linear relationship. The higher a person's BMI, the greater risk of them dying prematurely. But that's not what they found. Instead, Flegel and her colleagues discovered what statisticians called a U-shaped curve, with the bottom of the curve, the lowest risk of death, falling around 25 to 26 on the BMI chart, making the risk of early death lowest for those now labeled overweight. The differences we're talking about are overall pretty tiny, explains Catherine Flegel. So that's all I'm going to read about that, but there's more to that article. So if you want to go read it or read the book, please do so. But I wanted to start with that, kind of like talking about a few of the things that I want to point out today about is there an epidemic? Is it right to class it as an epidemic? What, if there is an epidemic, what could we do? And so we mentioned in that article, weights in children and adults going up from 1980 to 2000 and then stabilizing, right? And people have slowly become higher weight over a number of decades, right? Kind of like a slowly uptrend. What we know is not a lot. We don't know why, but there is a theory that the 70s is when we started really going balls to the wall with dieting. And here's the thing with people are getting, a little fatter. People are getting a little fatter, right? So what we're talking about here is fat people. So people who were already fat getting a little fatter. What we're not seeing or saw, because since 2000 stabilized, what we didn't see was thin people becoming fat. Okay, so this rise in, oh my God, in 1960, everyone was thin and there was just a couple of bad fatties walking around. And now it's 2002 and there's fat people everywhere. Is just not true, right? It's just not true, right? It's not like there was this huge change in body sizes and thin people overnight were suddenly, very fat people and oh my God, it's spreading. It's, contagious. It's a terrible thing that's happening. It's just not happening. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But this is the next this is the thing that I'm going to read out totally, and then we're going to have shorter quotes. So this next article is from The Atlantic, and it's called America's Moral Panic Over Obesity by Megan McArdle. Megan McArdle, actually both Megan and Paul in this article, Paul Campos say kind of things which I'm like, they're a little bit ableist. Megan is saying things which are diet culture-y, so I'm going to just point them out when they come up. So kind of just a heads up. But Megan interviewed Paul, and I was just like, this is so interesting. I wish I could hear the audio for this. But so this is how it goes. With healthcare in the news, everyone's looking for magic bullets to save money. Obesity seems to be a growing favourite. Wouldn't it be great if we could make everyone look like Jennifer Aniston and be cheaper to treat? By the way, this was written in 2009. If you're thinking, why the fuck is she referencing Jennifer Aniston? What? It's like me when I'm like, who's a stereotypically attractive Hollywood celebrity? And I'm always like Brad Pitt. And it's like, Brad Pitt is like 75 years old now. So like, come up with a new example, right? So yeah. And of course, he's not 75, he's 60 or something, 50, whatever. So continuing, there are a lot of holes in this theory. And also, even if he is 50 or 60, doesn't mean he's not attractive anymore. But I'm just thinking of, the stereotypical hunk, Hollywood hunk. Anyway, there's a lot of holes in this theory. The morbidly obese are very sick but die young, while lower levels of overweight/obesity aren't so well correlated with poor health. But still, the idea's power seems to be growing every day. This week, again, take what she's saying with a pinch of salt. This week, Health Affairs published a new study showing that quelle surprise, obesity accounts for an ever-growing share of our healthcare costs. They put the number at about 10%. I found that very interesting, right? So 10% of healthcare costs is treating fatness. Hang on a minute. I thought that we were in an epidemic where everyone's fat. Shouldn't it be like, I don't know, 90%? Like, shouldn't it be a higher number than 10%? I was like, 10%? And anyway, as we've established in other episodes, those numbers are really faulty. And we'll talk about that anyway. We'll keep going, giving it all away. So I decided to ask Paul Campos, the author of The Obesity Myth, what he thought. The book, which everyone should read, argues that the health benefits of losing weight are largely imaginary, that we are using, quote, health to advance our class bias in favour of thin people, particularly thin women. Women. That's how my mum says women. My mum says women in a really weird way. Okay, so Megan. Should I do a different voice for Megan so you know when Megan's speaking and when Paul's speaking? Yeah, I'll do like a slightly different voice for Megan and then just my normal voice for Paul. What's the voice going to be? The CDC is sponsoring a conference on obesity this week. In conjunction with this, the journal Health Affairs just published a study showing that almost 10% of US medical costs may be due to obesity. As we're debating the costs of public health care plan, controlling obesity is moving even further to the forefront of American public health agenda. What should we think of this? Paul. It's a terrible idea on all sorts of levels. There are three big problems with attempting to control healthcare costs by reducing so-called obesity. First, it's a fake problem. Second, the solutions for the problem are non-existent, even assuming the problem existed. Third, focusing on making Americans thinner diverts resources from real public health issues. Megan. Let's start with the first. If there's one thing that everyone in America knows, it's that being fat is really unhealthy. Why do you call it a fake problem? The correlations between higher weight and greater health risk are weak, except at statistical extremes. The extent to which those correlations are causal is poorly established. There is literally not a shred of evidence that turning fat people into thin people improves their health. And the reason there's no evidence is that there's no way to do it. So saying, let's improve health by turning fat people into thin people is every bit as irrational as saying, let's improve health by turning men into women or old people into young people. Actually, it's a lot crazier, ableist, because there actually are significant health differences between men and women, and the young and the old, much more so than between the fat and the thin. So why is it that the public health community is so set on this issue as a major driver of our healthcare costs? Because we're in the midst of a moral panic over fat, which has transformed the heavier than average into folk devils, to whom all sorts of social ills are ascribed. Aside from rising healthcare costs, well, according to the obesity mafia, love that phrase, obesity mafia, our kids are all going to die sooner than their parents, which sounds like a moral problem as well as one of healthcare costs. It's all complete nonsense. Do you think being overweight is a proxy for things that do make a difference, like fitness? It's a weak proxy, but yes, it has some marginal significance. It's good to encourage people of all sizes to be active and avoiding eating disorder behaviors like dieting, but this isn't because lifestyle changes will make fat people thin. They won't. I'd like to talk a little bit about the statistics, if I may. Please, we're all about statistics here. Okay. The CDC honchos and the authors of this study you referenced are in hysterics because the obesity rate, so-called, has roughly doubled in the last 30 years. But let's consider what that actually means. Obesity is defined completely arbitrarily as a body mass index of XXX. Now, body mass follows more or less a normal distribution, which means if the mean body weight is in the mid to high 20s, which it has been for many decades now, then tens of millions of people will have BMIs just below or just above the magic 30 line. So, if the average weight of the population goes up by 10 pounds, tens of millions of people who were just under the line will now be just over it. This might be meaningful if there was any evidence that people who have BMIs in the low 30s have different average health than the people with BMIs in the high 20s, but they don't at all. So the obesity epidemic is 100% a product of tens of millions of people having their BMIs creep over an arbitrary line. It's exactly as sensible as declaring that people who are 5'11" are healthy, but people who are 6'1" are sick. Adding to the absurdity of all of this, people with BMIs in the mid to high 20s actually have the best overall health and longest life expectancy, more so than those in the so-called, quote, normal BMI range. So we can't save billions of dollars by making people thinner? Consider the methodology of this study. It tried to calculate changes in health costs if everybody with a BMI over 30 had a BMI under 25. But leaving aside the preposterous assumption that all increased health risks associated with a level of body mass are caused by that level of body mass, the idea that somehow we could make fat people into thin people is bizarre. A study like this isn't talking about turning an 180-pound woman into a 165-pound woman, which at least in theory might actually be possible. He's saying that because when you're in a set weight range, right? Our set weight is, being between 10 and 20 pounds. And so it's kind of like losing weight to be in that set weight range is more likely possible. And especially short term it is, than losing weight from outside of your set point range. Continuing, it's talking about turning a 200-pound woman into a 130-pound woman on statistical average. The success rate for such attempts is around about 0.1%. I'm going to repeat the whole thing. A study like this isn't talking about turning an 180-pound woman into a 165-pound woman. It's talking about turning a 200-pound woman into a 130-pound woman on statistical average. The success rate for such attempts is around 0.1%. Even stomach amputation does not turn fat people into thin people. So even if it is true that we knew it would be beneficial to turn fat people into thin people, which we don't, is not something we have any idea how to do. The statements in the study indicating that there are known methods for doing this are simply lies of the most egregious sort. Now let's talk about excess healthcare costs. If you look at the study, nearly half of the excess healthcare costs associated with being fat are for higher rates of drug prescription. But why are fat people being prescribed more drugs? And largely because they have the, quote, disease of being fat, which is then treated directly and indirectly by prescription drugs. For instance, statins. Statins are a multi-billion-dollar business, but there's very little statistical evidence that they benefit the vast majority of people to whom they're prescribed. Basically, the only people who have lower CVD, cardiovascular disease, mortality after taking statins are middle-aged men with a history of CVD. But the heavier than average are prescribed statins at higher rates simply because they're heavier than average, even though there's no evidence this is beneficial for them. And of course, this doesn't touch on the cost of all the treatments for obesity in itself, which are uniformly ineffective. Also here, I would add in that Paul's not mentioned, is that fat people are tested more often, right? So fat people, if a fat person walks in, then it's like, well, shit, we need to test that motherfucker for diabetes because they're fat. Whereas a thin person is underdiagnosed because it's not likely that a doctor, unless it has some sort of history or signs or whatever, is going to look at a thin person's body and say, we need to run tests. I know, like, my blood work, I'm like, fucking hell, like, I've got the history of my life in blood work for forever, right? I feel like I've been tested for everything. And I wonder if that would be the same if I was thin. I don't know. But I know that fat people are more routinely checked for certain things because people are just doctors, healthcare providers presume that there's health risks there, and therefore then there's going to be more money spent on fat people versus thin people because thin people aren't getting the treatment that they deserve, and fat people are being tested more often for things that they might not have. Continuing, so this is Megan. You're saying that increased risks from being heavy come from what? Having gained weight in the first place, bad genetics, or dieting? As for where the increased risks associated with being heavy come from, such as they are, many of them come from weight cycling, which is clearly bad for people and which is the outcome of 98% of diets. Others come from the stress and social discrimination generated by having what's considered an inappropriate body in this culture. Other comes from diet drugs, eating disordered behavior, like dieting, poverty, all the things strongly associated with higher than average weight. This is me talking now. Since this article, since Paul's been speaking about this, research has come out to show that there's literally hundreds of reasons why people are fat, and the risks are exactly what he's saying is this stuff, right? Continuing, Megan says, what about gastric bypass? The quoted figures for gastric bypass seem pretty impressive when doctors talk about them on television. Great question, Megan, I'm thinking. Gastric bypass is surgically induced bulimia. People starve for the first few months, so of course their blood sugar levels go down. At 5 and 10 year follow-up, the average weight loss from these procedures is about 10 to 15% of body mass. It's actually less than that since lots of people drop out from the studies, which means most of these people will still end up, quote, morbidly obese, and they can never eat normally again. Why do you think that we never see the actual stats for weight loss on from stomach stapling? If they were good, they'd be on billboards 50 feet high. Yeah, right? Right? Megan says, those shows on TLC that basically invite the audience to gawk at fat people usually say they'll lose 50% of their excess body weight. Notice how Megan says excess body weight as if the body weight is bad. Paul says, if you put people on starvation diets, which is what these methods do, of course you'll get huge amounts of weight loss. then most of all or all of it will be gained back, which among other things is a recipe for congestive heart failure. I'd love to do a quote reality show on the contestants on shows like The Biggest Loser 3 years down the road, but that would be probably a little bit too much reality. And actually, since this has come out, there was an article, study, kind of follow-up on The Biggest Losers to see how they're doing. What was it in it? It was in the New York something, whatever. And basically, they're fat, right? And the ones who have kept it off are having to do really disordered things to keep it off. Paul continues, gastric bypass is the most radical method available for weight loss, and it basically doesn't work. Everything else is even less successful, though usually not quite as dangerous. Over the last 5 years or so, I've noticed that public health efforts about obesity are not just amping up the volume, but exploring increasingly coercive methods to induce weight loss. Taxes on junk food, lawsuits against fast food companies, which are basically tax on junk food, and so forth. Does that match your analysis? Notice here how Megan uses words like junk food, and that's stigmatizing, right? A lot of people will eat convenience food, and that's what's available, that's what's easy, that's what's filling and nutritious to feed the family, if you're, for many different reasons, and it doesn't make it junk. That's not Paul, that's me saying that. I'm just kind of like pointing out the things which I'm like, it's kind of, this is 10 years later, I'd probably change a few things here. Not that I did it, but, Paul says, it's the classic pattern of moral panics as public concern about the damage being done to the fabric of society by the folk devils increasingly intense demands are made on public officials to do something about the crisis, usually by eliminating the folk devils. Yeah, that kind of hand-wringing. Do something about this. You have to do something. And, policymakers who don't understand, don't know what's going on. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll put a tax on food and taxing food. That's going to help make sure that poor fat people die. Yes, great idea. Continuing, that of course is the strategy for this crisis. If fat people are the problem, then the solution is to get rid of them by making them thin people. The most amazing aspect of this whole thing for me has always been the imperviousness of policymakers, and even more so people who consider themselves serious academics and scientists, to the overwhelming evidence that there is no way to do this. I mean, there's no better established empirical proposition in medical science that we don't know how to make people thinner, but apparently this proposition is too disturbing to consider, even though it's about as well established as cigarettes causing lung cancer. So all of these proposals about improving public health by making people thinner are completely crazy. That's ableist. They are nonsensical as anything being proposed by public officials in our culture right now, which is saying something. It makes me think about, policymakers or scientists or whoever, and now, even in nowadays, right, it's very well established that we can't make fat people thinner. How it's almost like they're like zombies, right? Something has overtaken their brain, right? This, whatever it is that happens to zombies. And in our society, we've got the idea fat people are unhealthy, fat people should just lose weight, all of these things that we just quote, no. And no amount of evidence, even if they're doing the work themselves and they know that there is no evidence to prove that we can make fat people thinner and that fat is not necessarily unhealthy. It doesn't matter. Like, same with a zombie. It doesn't matter if you would reason with a zombie. If you said, hey, zombie, please don't eat me. The zombie's like, give me your brains, give me your brains. And it's the same with, obesity researchers. They're just like, I don't care because I think that it's bad to be fat. There's no reasoning. There's kind of like, they're just coming for the fatties, They're coming for the fatties. They think the fatties should just go away and stop being fat. And that's how I kind of see it of, oh my goodness, sometimes there's just no reasoning. You just have to run. You have to run. Continuing, it's conceivable that through some massive policy interventions, you might be able to reduce the population's average BMI from 27 to 25 or something like that. But what would be the point? There aren't any health differences to speak of for people between BMIs of about 20 and 35. So undertaking the public health equivalent of the Apollo program to reduce the populace's average BMI by a unit or two, and again, I will emphasize that we don't actually know if we could even do that, is an incredible waste of public health resources. The idea I'm hearing now is that we need to change the environment. But of course, if losing a great deal of weight actually makes you unhealthier, that might not save us money. The other idea I'm hearing a lot these days is that we have to save the kids, intervene when they're young so they don't get fat in the first place. So the strategies that have failed so spectacularly with adults, tell them to exercise more and eat less and shame them about their weight, will work with children? Because if there's one thing fat kids need, it's to be made to feel bad about being fat. The current stigmatization of fat kids is essentially child abuse as government policy, and the people behind it are, as far as I'm concerned, either incredibly stupid, ableism, or very evil, or in some cases, both. Here's an idea: stop harassing people about their weight. Because it appears that focusing on the idea that fat actually makes people fatter. Because it appears that focusing on the idea that being fat actually makes people make people fatter. I'd say this would be a little bit. I want to point out here that that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We're positioning it as fatness, increased fatness is a negative outcome, whereas it's just a different body size. And yes, there could be negative outcomes in regards to increased stigma and everything that comes from that. And what Paul's saying here is that it's doing the opposite that what people are trying to do, right? So if they genuinely want people to be thin, harassing them about being fat is not going to do that, right? At least there's an extremely strong correlation there. I bet if we stopped demonizing fatness, people would actually be a bit thinner. They'd certainly be happier and healthier. Megan says, what should we do instead if we want to reduce healthcare costs? Here are some proposed ideas I've heard. Taxes on soda. New urbanism, making people walk more. That's what new urbanism is. Bring back physical education in schools. Make gym memberships tax deductible. Menu labelling. Will any of this make us healthier, if not thinner? And if not, what will? Some of those ideas may have merit independent of whether they'll make people thinner. They won't. It's good to encourage physical activity, but not if the purpose of encouraging it is to try and make people thinner. Then it's counterproductive. People will be healthier if they're more active and don't smoke, and if they avoid eating disordered behaviors like dieting in particular. But Americans are actually very healthy and getting healthier all the time, despite the massive inefficiencies and dysfunctions of our healthcare system. Paul says another thing here. I'm not going to finish reading this bit, but Paul says another thing here is how people don't engage in quote health promoting behaviors because they're health promoting. It's because they will make them thin. And he says here, I know for a fact, because they've told me, that some public health officials engage in what they think of as a noble lie about the effects of physical activity on weight, because they know people won't become more active just to be healthier. So he's saying that public health officials public health officials have told him that they lie about the fact that working out will make people thinner, because it doesn't, right? It doesn't have any effect on our weight, and so they lie about it because people won't do it if they think, this is what the public health officials, people won't do it if they think that it's just going to be good for your health. They're doing it because they want to become thin. Yeah. So that's from the Atlantic. So we talked about the O word epidemic there. And I want to go to an oldie but a goodie. Well, it's actually a lot more recent than these ones, but the piece by your fat friend Aubrey Gordon, The Bizarre and Racist History of the BMI. And I'm going to tie all these things. So I'm just putting all these all these like ideas, concepts, whatever information out there, and then I'm going to sew it all together. Okay. The bizarre and racist history of the BMI. So I just want to quote from here. The body mass index was invented nearly 200 years ago by Adolphe Quetelet. Notably, Quetelet was not a physician, nor did he study medicine. He was best known for his sociological work aimed at identifying the characteristics of l'homme moyen, the average man, whom, to Quetelet, represented a social ideal. Quetelet was Belgian, publishing works in Western Europe during the early 19th century, a boom time for racist science. He is credited with co-founding the School of Positive Criminology, which asserted the dangerousness of the criminal to be the only measure of the extent to which he was punishable. That positive school laid the groundwork for criminologists like Cesare Lombroso, who believed that people of color were a separate species. Homo criminalis, Lombroso argued, were, quote, savages by birth, identified by physical characteristics that he claimed linked them to primates. For Lombroso, people of color were some kind of subspecies congenially driven to commit crimes. In addition to paving the way for Lombroso's work, Quetelet was also credited with founding the field of anthropometry, including the racist pseudoscience of phrenology. So phrenology, you remember in Django, when Leo DiCaprio brings out a skull, and so saying, okay, we can tell different races by their skull, and this is why white people are better. Obviously, all of that is fucked up and bullshit, and not true, you know. But you know, this is kind of like finding out the l'homme moyen, the ideal man, and man being the word exactly. Anyway, continuing. Quetelet believed that the mathematical mean of a population was its ideal, and his desire to prove it resulted in the invention of the BMI, a way of quantifying l'homme moyen's weight. Initially called the Quetelet Index, Quetelet derived the formula based solely on the size and measurement of French and Scottish participants. That is, the index was devised exclusively by and for Western Europeans. By the turn of the next century, Quetelet's l'homme moyen would be used as a measurement of fitness to parent and as a scientific justification for eugenics, the systemic sterilization of disabled people, autistic people, immigrants, poor people, and people of color. While Quetelet's work was used to justify scientific racism for decades to come, he was clear about one aspect of the BMI. It was never intended as a measure for individual body fat, build, or health. For its inventor, the BMI was a way of measuring populations, not individuals, and it was designed for the purposes of statistics, not individual health. So, do you remember the episode where we talked about the psychology of hunger? And in there was the Minnesota starvation experiment. The Minnesota starvation experiment was ran by Ansel Keys. Because the BMI wasn't called the BMI until Ansel Keys got his hands on it. And he was basically like, okay, well, we need to identify who is fat. Because, like, it might seem obvious to us now, like us in this year, that, well, obviously we know who's fat because we will weigh them and because our eyeballs will tell us that they are fat. But actually, that's not helpful, right? It's like saying, okay, here's a bag. We can see the size of the bag, but we don't know what's in the bag. So let's just measure the size of the bag to guess how much is in the bag. And so how much fat tissue is in the body We're going to measure how wide the bag is and how tall the bag is, and that's going to measure how much fat is in the body, which you could open the bag and it could be filled with who knows what, right? And anyway, even if it was filled with 100% fat or whatever, we don't know. We don't have the evidence to show that that is a negative thing, right? So even if we could say, okay, so this person is just 100% fat, nothing else in there, there's no brain, it's just fat. And the BMI has told us this because we've measured their height and their weight. And their weight is how much gravity that they have. It's not then telling us much else, right? And it's like this categorization of it's a disease. But when we think about a disease, what are the commonalities between diseases? You know, like, okay, so we can say that if someone has asthma, like me, I have asthma. Everyone who has asthma experiences, to certain degrees, a shortness of breath, tightening of the airways. They will take an inhaler. They may need to have other things. They also might have eczema. I don't know. But the whole main thing is everyone will have tightening of their chest, some restriction, and they won't be able to breathe properly. What is the commonality between fat people apart from nothing, right? There's no kind of common outcome. There's no common connected, clear kind of like, okay, so fatness, the disease, is here is what the outcomes of having the disease are. You know, every fat person has heart disease. Every fat person has type 2 diabetes. Every fat person, because that's not true. But hang on, they all have the disease of fatness. So surely it makes sense that there is commonalities. And it's because it's not actually a disease, but it's been labelled a disease, so that we can sell drugs and get insurance companies to pay for drugs, and we can continually stigmatize fat folks. Because, you know, and even though you know, some people are like, well, if we say that fatness is a disease, it's going to stop stigmatization. Hello, has anyone talked to the disability rights advocates and said how much stigmatization do people who have chronic illnesses, disabilities experience? Do they have a lack of stigmatization? No, they are really stigmatized, and obviously it's different for everybody, with different marginalizations that might come into play, and different diseases disabilities being seen as, you know, quote, better than others. But I mean, shit, that no. Anyway, so. Yeah, what I was talking about that was, Ansel Keys, even when he was doing his kind of like, well, how do we define fat people? He was like, well, the BMI is not that good, but it'll do, pig. You know, it's the best we've got, because he was using calipers and water retention. And now if you think about like water retention, that seems so funny and weird, like how we would decide a fat person about how much water they had in their body. And it seems funny and weird because we're not used to it, but and it seems so obvious that, well, fatness is defined by weight, but that's not obvious because it doesn't make sense, right? The same way, like if he had gone with water, we'd be like, well, obviously fatness is how much water you have in your body. And what do you mean it's how much gravity you have compared to the earth? That sounds weird, you know? It's just because it's just so normal for us. So, let me read this a little bit from here from Regan Chastain, who it's titled, It is wrong to charge large people more for insurance. And in this, Reagan talks about the newer history of the BMI and its categories. So, 3 members of the committee responsible for releasing the standards for obesity, including BMI as a risk measurement at the NIH, the National Institute of Health, I should have included that bit, had direct ties to pharmaceuticals that manufactured diet pills for profits. Let me read that again without me interjecting. So at the NIH, the three members of the committee responsible for releasing the standards for obesity, including BMI as a risk measurement, had direct ties to pharmaceuticals that manufactured diet pills for profit. A 4th member was a lead scientist for the Program Advisory Committee of Weight Watchers International. This committee advocated dieting for everyone who was a BMI more than 24. They shaved 15 to 20 pounds off the definition of, quote, ideal weight, which made over 60% of Americans overweight overnight. Soon we were hearing that 300,000 deaths a year were attributable to obesity. In January 2005, the CDC came out with the new, quote, obesity and death figures. These figures stated that no more than 110,000 deaths per year could be connected in any way with obesity. That's the Catherine Flegel thing. They also stated that the link may be a weak one. And so even with that 110,000 deaths associated with fatness, the link, quote, may be a weak one. The lead scientist of the CDC also said that a critical analysis of their data found that people whose weight fell within the overweight, obese, and severely obese BMI ranges tended to live longer than those whose weights fell within the so-called, quote, normal BMI ranges. Also, I want to point out here is that, you know how, everything that we talk about, it's so kind of US centric, right? And then also like UK centric, maybe, and Canada centric. Did you know that the BMI categories all over the world are different, right? So you could go travel to one country and then suddenly be, quote, a normal weight, and then travel to another one and then suddenly be an overweight. And it's not true, right, in regards to your weight has not changed, is that someone, somewhere, a group of people have decided, yeah, fuck it. I think that's what fat is. Yeah, fuck it. Wow, why not? And also the numbers of, okay, well, you know how it's 25 to 30, 30 to 35, 35 to 40. They just said, it sounds good. 5-point difference between them. That sounds good. There's no stats behind it. There's no evidence to say, actually, you know what? If someone goes from 29 to 30, then that's when shit gets real and they really just go into death fat. No, they just thought it sounded easy to remember. Science. So, is the obesity epidemic real? So I want to kind of wrap this with a ribbon. Epidemic, the word, means affecting or tending to affect a disproportionately large number of individuals within a population, community, or region at the same time. Excessively prevalent, contagious. Right, so what we know is slowly over a few decades, people got fatter. The people who got fatter were the people who were already fat, and straight-sized people didn't tend to get fat. This is leveled off. And even if there was this huge rise in fatness, oh my God, everyone is fat overnight, which, by the way, when that happened is when the NIH was like, let's just change the numbers. Even if 100% of the population was fat, okay, imagine that 100% of the population was fat. We don't have evidence to suggest that fatness causes poor health outcomes. Correlation is not causation. We have evidence to show that being fat reduces mortality. And we have no evidence to show how we can make fat people thin, or even if we could make fat people thin, that it would have any health benefits. In fact, we have evidence to show that it does the opposite, has health consequences. So it's like saying we have an epidemic of people with brown hair. Since 1980 to 2000, the number of brown-haired people walking around the streets with their brown hair is disproportionately large, it's excessively prevalent, and it's contagious. And the reason why that sounds silly is because we know that brown hair is just a normal trait of being a human being. We don't think brown hair means that the person is unhealthy, that they're going to die, and that they should just change their hair color to red hair or whatever. We're just like, well, okay, so there's more brown-haired people. That's interesting. I wonder why. You know, you might be like, well, you know, whatever. Or, you know, whatever characteristic about a person which is not actually something that we need to be alarmed about. But because of the way that we view fatness in our society, we're alarmed if there are more fat people around, even if there's not that many more fat people. Even if we know that you can be fat and healthy. Even if we know that fat people can't die from being fat, right? You can't die from being fat. You die from things that are related to fatness, and we know that we can treat those things outside of weight loss. There are more fat people than there were previously. We are healthier as a society than ever before in human history. So fatness does not mean that, or an increase of fat people does not mean that we are unhealthy. That well-known quote of children are going to die before their parents was based on some gastroenterologist's quote intuition. Yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, I'd say, you know, the obesity epidemic is just a load of bullshit, right? It's just a load of fat stigma. It's just a load of fat phobia. It's just a load of fucked up shit. Okay, so let's get all that information in just one little thing here. So, is the O word epidemic real? So first, let's look at the word epidemic. Epidemic means affecting a disproportionately large number of individuals within a populous community or region at the same time, excessively prevalent, contagious. So the only reason that there were suddenly millions more fat people overnight is because the National Institute of Health changed the BMI categories. Fat people have been getting a little bit fatter since the 1970s, 1980s, up to the 2000s, but straight-sized people haven't been getting fatter. So the fat people have been getting a little bit fatter, but straight-sized people haven't been moving into that fat category. The obesity epidemic is based on the BMI, which is 200 years old. The data was collected from European white, presumably cis men, and was never meant to measure individuals or health at all. It's just really just not based in science, and there's just no way to measure anything apart from someone's height divided by their weight. The third thing here to consider is that the categories of what normal weight and overweight they've been changed many times, And that's because of the influence and lobbying of diet companies. Also, they're arbitrary numbers. They're literally made up. And they said, let's just round it to 5 because 5 sounds good, it's easy to remember. So 25 to 30, 35 to 40, etc. Is not based on anything. It's just because sounds good and is easy to remember. The most recent change in 1998 from the NIH sparked the rhetoric around this epidemic, which came from that overnight change in numbers on a chart. So a group of people got together in a room and was like, okay, so we think we should lower what fatness is, lower the numbers. Turns out we've got millions of fat people just rolling around the streets, and yesterday we didn't. It's an epidemic. Is it? Or is it just a change in some numbers? It also then presumes that people who fall into higher weight categories are automatically unhealthy and a burden on society due to increased fat or weight on their body. There is no evidence to prove that actually having more adipose tissue, which is fat tissue on your body, leads to poorer health outcomes. What we do know that causes poorer health outcomes is 1, weight cycling, which is yo-yo dieting or dieting, 2, subpar or lack of access to healthcare, and 3, experiencing weight bias, the stress that comes from that. Remember, correlation is not causation. We also have great evidence to show that, quote, overweight people have reduced mortality compared to, quote, normal weight people, which is called the obesity paradox. The paradox being, we thought that fat people were dying all over the place, but they ain't. It's a paradox. And the word paradox means a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. And so for years we've have evidence that health outcomes of fat folks is not due to increased fat tissue, and so we know that it's coming from, if it is there, from other things. But then when evidence show there's decreased mortality in fat folks, people are like, oh my god, it can't be true, even though there's many years of evidence to show that it's okay to be fat. Also, you cannot die from fatness, right? You can die from things that are associated with fatness, but again, it is not proven that fatness in and of itself causes these negative outcomes. And let's just say we ignore all that. Let's say that we are in an obesity epidemic. Making a fat person into a smaller person doesn't mean that they will then have the same health outcomes as that smaller person. Pursuing health outside of weight loss is possible and proven. Also, there are 0 peer-reviewed controlled clinical studies that show any method of intentional weight loss works in the long term. So, is the obesity epidemic real? Doesn't show that there's any evidence that it's this thing where fat people are running around the streets and eating babies. And even if it was real, we don't have evidence to say that being fat, it makes you inherently unhealthy, or that we can lose weight in any way. So, I mean, the obesity epidemic basically is just a load of fat phobia, weight stigma, weight bias, moral panic about fat bodies, and we need to stop talking about it because it's not real and it's fucked up. Okay, so hopefully I tied everything together for you there. Yeah, so when you're at your next dinner party and cousin Keith says, says that. Basically, they'll say something about fatness, and you'll hear blah 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 blah, and then you can say that's what we've talked about in this episode. Okay, well, thanks for hanging out with me today. If you like the show and you really want to, you can send a review on Apple Podcasts. That would be cool. It would make me happy. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but it would be really cool if you did. That's the show. Thanks for hanging out. Stay fierce, fatty, and I'll see you in a while. Alligator, goodbye.
Perfect.